If you think about ancient Rome, it sounds like a pretty great place. Watching gladiators fight, going to bathhouses, casually walking through the city, and all of this in togas. Sounds pretty great, right? And when we think about ancient Rome today, we think of impressive buildings, huge banquets, and visions of grand processions. But as romantic as it sounds, would you, a person from the modern world, really be able to survive there? Welcome to Past Perspectives, and today we are taking a look at the dark side of ancient Rome. And I'm going to tell you why you probably wouldn't survive the rough life in ancient Rome. Now, the life in ancient Rome we have just described, the life full of toga parties, grand features, and architectural wonders like the Colosseum, was only that way for the wealthiest and most powerful Romans, the patricians. Only they were able to afford such luxury, while for the rest of the people, life back then wasn't all fun and games. The majority were plebeians, everyday folks like farmers, traders, and craftsmen. These people had no fancy villas, often living in cramped, multi-storied apartment buildings known as insulae that were prone to collapse and catch fire pretty easily. If you think that's unlucky, just wait until you find yourself at the very bottom of the social ladder, which were slaves that were often captured during Rome's numerous wars. And while they were the backbone of Rome's economy, they had no rights and were at the mercy of their masters. So if you imagine yourself laying on a couch being fed grapes while another servant fans you, you might have to think again, unless you were born into a high-class family. Life in Rome was likely filled with hardship and toil. But let's not be too hard on ourselves. Let's say you were born as an average citizen. Well, first of all, your job options weren't as diverse as today. You couldn't become a computer programmer, a psychologist, or a climate scientist. They hadn't even thought of these things yet. Instead, you might be a farmer, a soldier, or if you were lucky, a scribe. Life was tough and the work was grueling with little time for leisure. But what exactly could have happened to you, besides working yourself to death? Let's start with the basics, where you lived and how you kept yourself clean. Your house, if you can even call it that, it would have been quite a far cry from the comfortable home we know today. As an average Roman plebeian, you'd likely be crammed into a small, stuffy apartment in an insula. These insulae were the ancient equivalent of today's high-rise buildings and were often poorly built. Now, if you think about coming home from a hard day of work and having some time for yourself, you can forget about it. Many families lived together in 1 or 2 rooms with hardly any personal space. Privacy? That wasn't a thing. Plus, you'd be sharing a communal toilet with all of your neighbors. Talk about getting to know each other. And let's not even start with sanitation. Rome's sewage system, while advanced for its time, couldn't prevent the city streets from being filthy and smelly. Garbage was often thrown directly onto the streets, and clean drinking water was a luxury most could not afford. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and the plague were common, with frequent outbreaks decimating the population. Now let's move on to personal hygiene. While Romans did have public baths, not everyone could afford to use them regularly. Plus, these baths were often hot spots for disease transmission. Most people didn't bathe every day, and believe it or not, soap was not commonly used. Instead, Romans would apply oil to their skin and then scrape it off, along with the day's dirt and sweat. Imagine trading your daily shower and your favorite scented soap for that. And in the midst of all of this, life expectancy was low. Many Romans didn't make it past their 30s or 50s, and infant mortality was incredibly high. But hard work, cramped living conditions, poor sanitation, and the lack of personal hygiene are just the start of the things that could cut your life short when you were just getting the hang of things. The next worst thing, after the way you lived and how you cleaned, was the way how you ate and drank. While food and water are essential for survival, in ancient Rome, even these basic necessities could pose a serious threat to your health. When we think of Mediterranean meals today, most of us get hungry immediately, but the average Roman's diet was far from what we picture today. Most Romans were on a diet that primarily consisted of grain in the form of bread or porridge. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and meat were often too expensive for the average Roman, so they weren't able to afford it on a regular basis. Nutrition wasn't exactly high on the list as well. If you were poor, you ate what you could afford, and that meant a lot of carbs and not much else. This kind of diet could lead to all sorts of health problems, including malnutrition and related diseases. Water, or more precisely the quality of it, was another issue. Rome's aqueducts were an engineering marvel, supplying the city with running water. However, this water was often contaminated. It ran through lead pipes, which could cause lead poisoning. Plus, with no understanding of bacteria, the water could be polluted with all sorts of nasty things that could make you seriously ill. Then there's the wine. Romans loved their wine. In fact, they drank it like we drink water today, as it was often safer than drinking water straight from the tap. But the wine they drank was not the same as the carefully aged and finely flavored wines we enjoy today. Roman wine was often watered down and mixed with additives like honey, spices, and even seawater. While you might not get sick from drinking it, it was definitely an acquired taste. Between the potential for malnutrition from the limited diet, the risk of lead poisoning or other diseases from contaminated water, and the questionable quality of Roman wine, feeding yourself in ancient Rome was a survival challenge all on its own, and we are barely scratching the surface. If you still think that you might make it past 60 at this point, let me introduce you to the heavy hand of the state and social injustice. Looking at the writings we have found from the old Rome, it seemed that they had a rule or a tax for just about everything. And some of these rules were extremely harsh. As far as the taxes, everybody had to pay them, from the richest Roman to the poorest peasant. Now, if you think today's tax system is complicated and unfair, wait until you hear about Romans' tax. For example, if you owned land, you paid a land tax. If you didn't, you still paid a personal tax based on an estimate of what you might own. And in this tax system, death couldn't save you as well. The vixima hereditatium, or 20th of inheritances, was a tax imposed on any inheritance that was left to anyone other than the closest relatives. So, if you planned on leaving something to a distant relative or a friend, you could bet that 5% of it would go to the state before it reached them. It could feel like you were being penalized just for living and for dying. But this isn't the end of it, so let's talk about the law. The Roman legal system was often harsh and unbalanced. There was no concept of innocent until proven guilty. If you were accused of a crime, you were guilty unless you could prove your innocence, and the punishments could be brutal. Thieves were often sentenced to hard labor, sometimes for life. Worse still, crimes like treason could earn you a death sentence, often carried out in the most public and gruesome ways for all to see. Also, corruption was a significant problem in Roman society. Rich and influential people often escaped punishment for their crimes while the poor suffered. It was not uncommon for the rich to bribe their way out of trouble or to use their influence to sway legal decisions in their favor. And if the hunger or the state couldn't get you, then it was time for crime and violence to finish you off. Violence was woven into the very fabric of Roman society and was a fact of life you would have to face on a daily basis. Just taking a walk down the street was a risk in and of itself. Unlike today's relatively safe city streets, in Rome, law and order were precarious. Violent clashes between rival political gangs were commonplace, making some parts of the city no-go zones if you valued your safety. But danger didn't just lurk in the dark alleys. Even in the heart of Rome, the political upheaval was a constant part of life. The Roman Republic was often rocked by internal power struggles, which could result in open conflict, not to mention the frequent threats of invasion by rival empires. Living under such uncertainty would certainly have been stressful, to say the least. Oh, and let's not forget about the mandatory military service. Depending on the time you lived in ancient Rome, you could get pretty unlucky. If you were a male citizen between the ages of 17 and 46, then things didn't look too bright for you. If Rome was in a heavy war and they needed men urgently, then you were expected to serve in the Roman military for at least 25 years. This was a harsh and often brutal existence, with the constant threat of being sent to war and the very real possibility of death or severe injury. So there you have it. Without the lack of modern conveniences we take for granted today, most of us wouldn't make it. Imagine a life without electricity, running water, refrigeration, or quick transport. And if you fell ill, you couldn't rely on modern medicine or hospitals. Healthcare was basic at best, and many ailments we can easily treat today were often deadly back then. The strenuous physical labor combined with these hardships would make everyday life a test of survival. So in summary, the ancient Rome wasn't the idyllic existence we often imagine, but please let me know down in the comments if you still think you'd make it in ancient Rome and what your battle plan would be. I'm curious to get to know about it. Also, if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to Past Perspectives to learn about all the history topics you've never learned about in school. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and until next time.